The trim range function in Excel is a brand new function that allows us to refer to specific areas of the spreadsheet. You can also use a new way of referring to cells in lieu of the full trim range function in certain situations. Let's take a look at the idea behind the trim range function. Let's say that you have a spreadsheet, and clearly you're not filling out the entire spreadsheet just yet. Let's say you have 3 customers, and pretty soon you'll have 3,000 or 30,000 customers. Now, we want to add up the year-to-date sales here. And we know that we want to be on top of the future. So what a lot of people will do is they'll pre-select more than what is necessary. They'll say, please take the sum of everything in this entire column. Now, the problem with that is that oftentimes it means referring to about 1 million extra cells, which can bog down your spreadsheet, can make your file sizes larger, can make everything a lot sloppier. And while there are other ways to get around this, like using tables, for example, the new trim range function can be inserted into any existing function to take the range of cells that you're referring to and chop it down. So in this situation, if you were to take the trim range function and put it around that reference to the entire column, it would dynamically snap it to just the entries that were filled in. Now, a moment ago, I said that there was another way of doing something very, very similar, and that's because there's a new trim reference. Let's say, for example, that these cells were actually cells B2 through B95. Now, when you highlight the reference B2 through B95, that's a static area. But if you put a decimal just to the left of the colon, then it will take off any extra rows above the data set. And if you put a period just to the right of the colon, it'll take any blank rows off the bottom of the data set. So in this situation, there are no blank rows above this data set, but there's a lot of blank rows below. So by just putting a period right after the colon here, so the reference is now B2 colon period B95, it dynamically chops it down to only the cells that are actually filled in. Let's see this in a real spreadsheet. The trim range function is always used in conjunction with a different function whose job it is to do a calculation. So, for example, let's say that we wanted to go to cell H6 and create a unique list of all the customer types. We could type in =, unique, and then highlight the column that has all the customer types in it. Then close the parentheses and hit enter, and we see that there are 3 unique customer types in that column. However, we face a problem here where the data may change in size. There are several ways to deal with this. We could, for example, simply highlight the entire E column. We could convert this data into a table. But if we wanted to allow for flexibility without using a table in certain circumstances, and not necessarily include 1 million extra rows, what we would do is put inside the unique function the trim range function in order to trim down a larger column into a smaller column. So here, for example, I'll erase what I just wrote and instead do a unique function and pre-highlight from cell E6 down for a few extra cells, let's say down to row 50 or so. If that's as far as we expect to go, we can then close the parentheses, but as we see, we include an extra space down here for anything that's not filled in, and that gives us the 0 value. So what we do is inside of the unique function, around E6 through E50, we put in the function TRIMRANGE. And by putting TRIMRANGE around this function, it simply says, I'll pay attention to how many of these are filled in, and I will give you just the subset that you need. And so right here you can see that it doesn't include the blanks down below. It may be highlighting this entire column, but it's only using down to row 29. Now, interestingly, the TRIMRANGE function can also be replaced by a different type of notation. So if I take TRIMRANGE out and continue using E6 through E50, what I need to do is put a decimal, a dot, either right before the colon, right after the colon, or in both places. If I'm assuming that there may be blank columns, if I'm assuming that there may be blank rows at the top of this data set, I would put the decimal, the dot, right after E6 and before the colon. If I assume that there are blank rows below this data set, then I would put it right after the colon, right before the reference to cell E50. And so in this situation, I just put the decimal point here before E50, and it performs the exact same operation as the TRIMRANGE function. And we can see this again if we use =SUMIFS, and we want to pre-highlight a larger sum range, larger criteria range, and larger criteria area. What I can do is I can highlight the sum range of F6 down to, let's say, F50 again. And again, press the decimal right after the colon, saying that it may not go as far down as F50. Then after the comma, highlight all the customer types. You always want to make sure that these match in height. And again, make sure that there is the decimal after the colon here. And then finally, after a comma, you could use a spill range here, but I will use the same trim range. I'm going to highlight, let's say, down to about here. And again, press the decimal right after the colon and close the parentheses. And just like that, it has spilled perfectly into those three rows. Now, something that's interesting here is that as you fill this data in, because you can't possibly fill in the customer type and the year-to-date purchase at the same time, we will momentarily get some error messages. Let's see how that works. So I will say that there is a new customer called CS1090 here. That customer is in Europe, and then I will invent a new customer type called a non-profit. So the hope here is once I enter non-profit, that my unique function will increase, making a new row for the non-profit. But we also recognize that that SUMIFS function is assuming that there's the same number of customers as there are purchases. And so when I press the tab key right here, you see that yes, the unique function has filled down farther in order to give me non-profit, but I momentarily have these error messages, and this is because non-profit is one row lower than the year-to-date purchases. So I will say that this customer has purchased $50,000 worth of material from us, and once I hit enter, you see there that it fills in perfectly. Again, every time that you have an imbalance back and forth between the two columns that are being used for the expression, you'll get an error message temporarily, but you can see there that it automatically detects and handles the problem.